It's kind of an overview with a little bit of some new diseases to watch for, some synthesis of some collaborative work around pollinators. So it's kind of a little bit of everything. Okay, so first of all, I was just asking Salt at the beginning of this, where did my title for this come from? Managing insects over the long haul. So what do I mean by the long haul? And this is where I mean, how do we think about managing insects in the context of integrated pest management? Or I have here IPP, which is a term that some people have embraced to highlight the importance of pollinators in our pest management decisions, especially when we're talking about flowering crops that rely on insect pollination, right? So in the context of integrated pest or integrated pest and pollinator management, this is a long-term strategy. So that's what I mean by the long haul here. We have to think about how we're managing our growing environment, not just within one season for one cropping cycle, but what does it look like over many years in our crop rotations. So just so we're all on the same page, when I'm talking about IPM, I really prefer this definition, which is the ecosystem-based strategy that focuses on long-term prevention of pests or their damage through a combination of techniques. And so I also want to show you one of my favorite visuals of what we mean by a combination of techniques. So this image of the IPM triangle, I think, is a really good visual that shows you what those different techniques are in terms of pest management and sort of the priority or the order in which we should be applying these techniques. So if you look at the bottom of our triangle, you see agronomic practices. So these are preventative measures such as crop rotation, planting resistant varieties, intercropping, and the protection and enhancement of beneficial insects. And so in our cucurbit systems, oftentimes we think about pollinators, but today I'll also talk about some of our natural enemies that we can be manipulating the environment to help enhance and protect. Then we have the next layer on here is the decision support. So how and when are we making decisions around pest management in our crops? So this is where I'll talk a little bit about monitoring, using thresholds, forecasting tools to be able to help predict or identify when the crop is actually present or when the pest is present in the crop. Then once we get to that, there are the interventions. What do we do once we do encounter this pest? So we'll talk a little bit about mechanical, physical, and natural control, the role that natural enemies play in biological control, and then as a last resort, chemical control, and how do we select chemicals that are pollinator or beneficial insects. So first I'm going to go over sort of a fast review of what the pests are in these systems and particular things that we need to know about their biology and the potential damage they can cause in our cucurbit crops. Then I'll review some of the beneficial organisms in our region in particular that we find in these cropping systems. And lastly, talk about how do we integrate tactics for management. So the first group of pests is one that I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And here we're talking about aphids. In our melon crops, or our cucurbit crops, oftentimes we're referring to the melon aphid, Aphis cucurbit. So just a reminder to you that the color is not an indicator of the species. Aphis cucurbit can appear on the landscape in many different colors. Sometimes they can be almost very dark black, green to yellow. The important thing to know is that they are one of the smaller aphids, and they look particularly small when we're scouting the broad leaves of cucurbits, right? What you need to know about their biology and their life cycle. They are a generalist, so they can feed on plants outside of cucurbit. So managing alternative hosts is not very viable for this insect because if you don't have a cucurbit on the landscape, they can feed on something else. They go through what we call incomplete metamorphosis, meaning the juveniles look just like the adults in a smaller version. This also means that we do not have eggs in this system. So the aphids are always there in that sort of recognizable nymph or adult form on the plant surface. There are no eggs when we're talking about aphids and cucurbit. And the other thing you need to know is that they feed with piercing, sucking mouth parts. So visible damage on the plant is not what some people would typically associate with herbivore insects because they're not chewing holes in the plant, but rather they're oftentimes on the undersides of the leaves, and they're very sneaky in that they're just sticking this little needle mouth part into the plant and sucking out plant juices. So the damage that you see from them can sometimes be confused with physiological stress or nutrient stress or disease stress because it usually induces misshaping in the leaves or changes in the color of the foliage as a result of those plant nutrients being removed. And the other fun fact is if you look in this picture here, oftentimes aphids are being tended by ants. So sometimes it's easier when you're scouting in a field to see a flurry of ant activity, and that can be an indication that there are aphids on the underside of that leaf. And that is because aphids are feeding on the sugary photosynthase of the plant, and they consume more sugar than they can utilize in their digestion. So they excrete it out the back, and then the ants come and eat the sugary snack and protect them from natural enemies. The reason aphids are important is because they can transmit, in cucurbits in particular, a variety of different viruses that can infect our plants. And my best advice here is that if you have symptoms on the plant where the tissue looks yellow or crinkled or different, you should really sample that and send it into the plant and pest diagnostic lab, because the more we're sampling, the more viruses we're finding in these crops and getting a better understanding of those that may be seed transmitted versus those that may be insect transmitted. So if you think there's a disease at play, I highly recommend sending in a sample to get verification. And the reason why they are a problem for yield in these crops is that ability for them to vector diseases, but also if they go unchecked, you can get very high populations that can reduce plant growth and reduce the quality or the number of fruits that that plant puts on. And this is just an example of a really severe infestation of aphids. The next pest is mites. And so I mention mites because they can be very detrimental when they occur, but I would say that they are very weather dependent. So I'm not sure. Growers have different experiences, I guess is my point. Some growers battle mites every single year. Some growers do not, and mites tend to maybe spring up on them when they're unexpected. So one of the reasons for that is mites thrive in hot and dry conditions. So if we have a very dry summer with very little rainfall and you're growing out in the open fields, oftentimes mites get knocked off the plant and drowned. If we are having a drought year and your plants are drought stressed, mites thrive on that. So hot, dry conditions, they reproduce very quickly. They can reproduce more quickly on plants that are drought stressed as well. So those populations build up. So rainfall is one of the main mortality factors for this insect in the field. So to watch for mites and is again looking at the symptoms on the plant, this sort of yellowing that you can see. I'm going to try to get my laser pointer here. This sort of yellowing and stippling that you can see. And again, they usually colonize the undersides of the leaves first. And so flipping over those leaves and looking for that stippling or yellowing, or they're very small, but the species that we see the most often is two-spotted spider mite. So you will see this sort of black dots scurrying around on the surface of the leaves if you have mite. And this is when you get higher infestations, this is what the upper surface of a watermelon leaf would look like. So you can begin to see that damage on the upper surface if the populations get really high, and that sort of stippling and yellowing around the sort of, here it's clustered sort of around the mid-veins of the leaves. Under very high conditions, especially if you're growing in protected environments, you can get the webbing that their name comes from, spider mite comes from. So this cucumber plant here is completely desiccated and dried out from the population of spider mites that has colonized it, and you can see the leaves are covered in webbing material. The next pest is whiteflies. This one again doesn't occur very often for us, but you should be aware of it and be able to recognize it. In southern portions of the United States, they are a larger problem because of their ability to vector viruses. In our colder climates, they don't overwinter, so there's usually migrating populations that are coming up. So again, it's sort of weather dependent. if they become an issue or not in our cropping systems. And if they do, it's much later in the season. So we oftentimes don't have the diseases associated with whiteflies. But it's important to know or recognize what they look like. Sometimes they are mistaken for aphids. And this is, again, an example of in a protected environment here in Indiana, where we experienced a very high infestation of whiteflies. And I just want to point out here, amidst all the adults and the eggs and nymph stages of whiteflies, we do have natural enemies, which I'll detail in the coming slides. But you can see a picture here of a little maggot that feeds on the whiteflies and another one here. And I'll show you what those are in just a moment. Okay, cucumber beetles. This is probably one of the biggest pests that you're concerned with and thinking about. So, two different species that are the predominant cucumber beetles that occur in our area. The first one on the right-hand side here is the striped cucumber beetle. So this is a cucurbit specialist, meaning this insect has to feed on cucurbit crops in order to survive in the environment. So in some instances, crop rotation can help reduce the populations of cucumber beetles, because if you don't have cucurbit hosts on the landscape, they cannot survive. Alternatively, on the left-hand side here, we have the spotted cucumber beetle. This is actually a generalist pest. An alternative name for it is corn rootworm. So the larval stages, oftentimes early in the season, are feeding on corn plants. The larvae are in the soil, and the spotted cucumber beetles tend to move into our cucurbit crops later in the season. So they're oftentimes found in the flowers late in the season and potentially feeding on the fruits. Again, they're a generalist, so crop rotation won't manage them, and they can also impact other crops that you're growing. Like here you can see adults feeding on a tomato. The beetles didn't cause this damage. It was a caterpillar that cut the tomato open and ate it, but the beetles are on the outside feeding here. So the reason that we are concerned with cucumber beetles first is because we can see overwhelming numbers of them at certain times in the field, and also because they are responsible for transmitting a disease. So the striped cucumber beetle is the main vector in our region, and the disease that they transmit is called bacterial wilt. This is a bacterial pathogen that lives in the xylem of the plant, so the water transport system of the plant. And when the beetles feed on the plant or mate in the flowers and they deposit frass, which is insect poop, that has the bacteria in it, it can enter into the plant. So the beetle creates the entry wound for the bacteria to get into the plant. And the beetle carries the bacteria either in its saliva or in its frass. So it is the vector of this pathogen. And once the pathogen gets into the plant, it starts in that localized area where the beetle was feeding and it became inoculated, but it is systemic in the sense that the entire plant will eventually wilt and die. So there is no sort of pruning away damaged material or curing a plant of bacterial wilt infection. So that is what makes it so devastating. When we're talking about cucurbit production, it is cucumbers and cantaloupe that are the most susceptible to this disease. So cucumber beetle management, those cucurbit crops, cucumbers and cantaloupe, is pretty intense, and we have very low thresholds. If we are talking about squashes, pumpkins, and watermelon, those plants typically do not get the bacterial infection. So in those cucurbit crops, we are only managing the direct damage that the beetles are causing. So the physical removal of leaf tissue or the physical damage on the fruits themselves of beetles feeding on the fruit. But we have a much higher threshold in that situation because we don't have to worry about the disease transmission. Squash vine borer is another pest in this system that can cause wilting of the plants. But this is very different than that bacterial wilt disease, because the wilt that occurs as a result of squash vine borer infestation is because the insect itself is chewing on and breaking the water transport to that particular stem. So a plant that is infested with squash vine borers can recover, and it's only the stems that that insect has fed on that will break off and become wilting. And so what you can see down here is this one also has a bit of some water stress and some squash vine borer happening on some of these branches, but the other branches in this plant will still grow and just be fine. And so what's happening here is we have this bright colored adult day flying moth that flies around in the crop. Again, it is a cucurbit specialist, so sometimes rotation can help manage this pest. It will lay its eggs at the base of the plant, at the base of those stems. And once the egg hatches, it burrows into the plant and then it feeds on that stem where the egg was laid. So the way that you can identify that it's squash vine borer and not bacterial wilt is by investigating the basal area of those stems. And you can see the hole where the caterpillar went in, or sometimes you can see the actual plant material and again the frass or the poop that caterpillar generates pushing out that hole. And you can open up the stem and sometimes find the caterpillar in there. Other times you'll just see this sort of cavity where they were feeding. And then the last one, and maybe the second biggest pest behind cucumber beetles, are squash bugs. So again, squash bugs are a specialist. So crop rotation can sometimes help to manage this pest. It must have a cucurbit plant, the landscape, to be able to reproduce. This is a native species. It's endemic in our area, and the adults are the stage that overwinter. So in the springtime, when things start to warm up, the adults come out of the leaf litter or the harborage where they spent their winter, and they immediately are mating and looking for cucurbit plants to lay their eggs on. So identifying the eggs is crucial in terms of being able to identify when they first get into the crop in the spring and to help with early intervention and management. And their eggs are very unique. They're this dark bronze color and they are laid in very straight lines in clusters. The eggs are most often found on stems or on the undersides of leaves. They again are an insect that goes through incomplete metamorphosis. So the immatures look very much like the adults. They just get bigger. When the eggs hatch, the nymphs are clustered for a very short amount of time, and then they disperse throughout the plant. And squash bugs prefer to be foraging and feeding in sort of hidden places. So undersides of leaves, down at the base of the plant if you're using plastic, in the plastic. So they're not out prancing around on the leaf surface. So again, flipping over leaves and looking for those egg masses and those nymphs is really important to have the correct timing to be able to intervene and manage these insects. And so ideally, if you're using an insecticide for management, you're starting early in the season, you're scouting for these eggs, and you want to make applications right when the eggs are hatching. So that's why we say it's about 10 days from the time you find an egg cluster to when those nymphs are hatching. And this is the ideal time to make chemical applications to manage them. A, because they're the most vulnerable when they're young, and B, because they're still fairly clustered together. And so getting coverage of that whole little pack of nymphs is much easier than when they begin to disperse. And then the coverage becomes very important and can be more difficult for large plants. And the reason I think that, or at least in my experience, I hear about them most often in sort of the end of the season, and everyone's like, oh, they're the bane of my existence, right? And that's when they have had all summer to be reproducing and the populations are very large, and you end up seeing them on the surface of the fruits and the developing fruits and creating feeding wounds and scars and damage on the fruits themselves. So the key is recognizing that they have overwintered on the landscape, and in the early spring, those adults are out, and that's when they're going to start reproducing and building up those populations. So early season scouting and management helps prevent situations where you have thousands when you are at fruit ripening stages. A newer pathogen that I am working with our plant pathologist, Cesar Escalante, to help get a better understanding of its occurrence in the Midwest is something called cucurbit yellow vine decline. And so this is, from my understanding, a fairly new pathogen, and we're just beginning to understand some of the vectors and the geographic location of where it occurs. So we do know that squash bug is one of the primary vectors that transmits this pathogen on the landscape. There is also some evidence from the lab that cucumber beetles have the capacity to transmit this pathogen as well. So I think sometimes it probably goes undetected because it creates yellowing in the plants and eventual desiccation and wilting. So a lot of the things that we talked about today lead to eventual yellowing and wilting of the plants. But here is a panel of images that show the symptoms of cucurbit yellow vine decline on a variety of different crops. But what you're looking for is this intense yellowing of leaves. Eventually you get a sort of vine wilting and vine decline. And the key for diagnosing it is cutting open the stems and again looking for this sort of corking and yellowing color in the center of the stems. So this is another pathogen that I would say if you see yellowing or any of these types of symptoms in your crop, I highly recommend taking a sample and sending it in to the plant and pest diagnostic lab because we're trying to really understand how prevalent it is in our growing regions. And so we need to get some clear pathology diagnosis to verify the severity. Okay, so those are the pests to orient yourselves to in the cropping system. So I want to spend some time highlighting the beneficials first because pollination is very important, but then there are also a lot of natural enemies that play an important role in managing some of these pests. So first we'll talk about the pollinators. So if we're talking about pumpkins here, we have a fairly simple community of bees that really are responsible and contribute to pumpkin pollination. This is the squash bee, honeybees, and bumblebees. If we look at cucurbits or pickling cucumbers in particular, this was some work that Zofia Sendre and a couple postdocs in her lab spent some time doing pollination observations in pickling cucumbers, and 98% of all bee visits to those flowers in pickling cucumber fields were honeybees. 1% was bumblebees and 1% were other wild bees. And so these are coming out of commercial pickling cucumber farms in Michigan. The pumpkin observations were done in Ohio. And then lastly here we have watermelon pollinator communities, which these observations were done all over the state of Indiana. And of our cucurbit crops, this one seems to have the most diverse set of pollinators. And so I will show you in the next figure what that pollinator community looks like. So if we look at floral visits, watermelon flowers, 40% of the flower visits occur by sweat bees. So really tiny little fuzzy bees that are black or metallic green. Again, this crop they do bring in honeybees for pollination, and 28% of the observations were honeybees. Then we have the two-spotted longhorn bee, bumblebees, which are supplemented in some of these fields with the commercial bumblebee hives. Syrphid flies represent 11%, so that's actually a fly, not a bee. Other non-bees and 1% other bees. So it's important here to recognize that we are managing 28% of the pollination that's happening in this crop of the pollinator visits, while as the other 72% is coming from non-managed native bees that are relying on the environment and the resources in that environment to be able to sustain themselves and visit and provide pollination to these crops. I just wanted to show one graphic here. We do have, out of our Purdue pollinator protection series of publications, we have a new one out that is showing you activity periods for the most common wild bees that are important in pollinating apples, blueberries, tomatoes, and watermelon in our Midwest crops. So again, just highlighting the role that native bees play a very important role in crop management in these systems. And for watermelons or our later season crops, we're really talking about bumblebees, sweat bees, and the longhorn bees that are out during our cucurbit flowering time. So in addition to pollinators, we have a lot of natural enemies that are present and very good at helping to control some of our. So if we return back to aphids, there's a very diverse group of pollinators that are of natural enemies that help manage aphid populations. So we have parasitoid wasps, and this one is important for you to learn to recognize because as a result of their attacks on aphids, the aphid body and carcass still remains on the plant. So it's really important for you to go out and scout, first of all, which we'll talk about in tactics, but also to be able to recognize when you do have those natural enemies present and they are helping to suppress the population. So this picture down here on the bottom left, more than half of the aphids in that picture are actually parasitized. So under attack, no longer damaging the plant. And the way that we can tell is through these gold, sort of bloated mummies that we call them. It's the cadaver left behind by the aphid, and the parasitoid is right here. My cursor is covering it right now. So it's a teeny tiny little wasp, but it lays its egg or its larva inside of the aphid body, and it develops inside of that aphid and then hatches. So seeing these bloated aphids is good because they have been infected by the wasp. And then when you see the little hole on their bum, even that tells you that the adult wasp has exited. So there's no reason to intervene in this situation, despite how bad it may look, because those aphids are under control and being managed. Another natural enemy that we have are lady beetles. These are pretty common. I think most of you can recognize adults, but this is what the larvae look like. Both adults and larvae are feeding on the aphids, so they're actually consuming the aphid bodies. Lacewings are quite common as well. The adults don't provide the natural enemy or the predation, but it is the larval stages. So the lacewings lay an egg on a silk stalk with a little white dot on the edge. So this is something that's important to recognize. Then the larva will hatch out and crawl down, and this is what the larva look like. So this is the life stage of lacewings that are actually doing your pest management and consuming aphids and other soft-bodied pests. Another one that's really dominant, especially later in the season, is the minute pirate bug. So this is a true bug predator, so it uses its piercing mouth to attack aphids. This is what the adult looks like, and this is the nymph, or the immature stage. Late in the fall, they become very abundant, and sometimes you'll feel them biting your arms. So that is a good insect. And this one is the one that I tried to circle with the whiteflies, but these are the larval or maggot stages of a variety of predatory flies. So mostly syrphid flies. They're the most common that we see, but there's also an aphid midge fly and then another fly called the aphid fly that we find quite abundant in these systems. So it's important to be able to recognize these very little sort of slug maggots on the undersides of the leaves, but they are inching along and feeding on lots and lots of aphids as they develop into adults. And then again, the adult syrphid fly is actually contributing to pollination in some of these crops. For squash bugs, this one I don't see very often, but people continue to ask me about them. So I've done a little more digging to figure this out. So there are actually a variety of natural enemies that help to manage squash bug populations, but one that is getting more attention in the research side of things lately are these two parasitoids. So on the left here, it's a tiny little parasitoid wasp that parasitizes squash bug eggs. And so this is quite abundant in more southern regions. I'm not sure how often we can find it here, but an important population regulator for squash bugs. And then we also have a parasitoid fly here that lays its egg on the adult. And so this little white egg here on the adult squash bug is that parasitic fly that will then infest and help manage squash bug populations. So we do have natural enemies present for that pest on the landscape as well. But we also have a variety of what we would call sort of generalist natural enemies that help in pest regulation. And these generalist ones are what you can find feeding sometimes some of our larger pests, adult squash bugs, adult cucumber beetles. And so this is a navid bug, a wheel bug. This is an ant lion and a predatory stink bug on the right here that has the striped cucumber beetle. And then we have a variety of predators that sort of live at the soil surface. So when we're talking about the insects that lay their eggs at the base of the plant and the larvae that are potentially feeding at or just below the soil surface, we have a variety of predatory beetles. So fireflies, soldier beetles, ground beetles, where the larval stages are at the soil surface and feeding on pests. And the adult stages can be seen above ground, preying on insects or fumbling around even and inadvertently pollinating in some of our flowers. And spiders. Spiders are really important predators in agricultural systems, and they feed, again, they're generalists. So they feed on a wide variety of different insects and pests, and some of the best natural enemies for things like squash bugs and cucumber beetles. So that is my introduction to beneficials, and then we'll talk about tactics to help to conserve them in these systems. Do we have any questions now, Salta, on that?
Nope, no questions yet.
Okay. I wanted to introduce you to that sort of diversity of beneficial insects because now I'm going to try to convince you to do a few things in the environment to help to conserve that. So one of the things you can do is most obvious, reduce the amount of pesticides that you're using. And the first step for that is abiding by the fact that we don't make applications until we know that the pest is present. And for some of these cucurbit pests, we have very clear thresholds that we can recommend. So scouting is very important. When we go to cucumber beetles in particular, the thresholds that we have for should you intervene or not are based on the susceptibility of the crop to that bacteria. So one beetle per plant is your threshold for cucumbers and cantaloupe because they are susceptible to that bacterial wilt that the beetles are transmitting. 5 beetles per plant when we talk about squash, pumpkin, and watermelon. There we're managing the direct damage of that leaf defoliation or that chewing on the fruits themselves. So we have a higher threshold. And so what does that look like? John Turnist, who was a master's student at Purdue, worked on a scouting plan to give you recommendations on how to be able to go out into the field and determine if you're at those thresholds for cucumber beetles. So he did some math here and some scouting to determine the number of samples that are required with a 95% confidence that you can detect one beetle per plant for cucumber and cantaloupe, or 5 beetles per plant for pumpkin, squash, and watermelon. So obviously, so they are sort of randomly dispersed in the field. So the lower the threshold, the more plants you have to look at. So if you are doing the 1 beetle per plant, you have to look at about 26 plants in your field. If you are looking for 5 beetles per plant, that number goes down drastically, and you only have to scout 7 plants in your field. And so how do we do that? Well, we just go out into the field and we sort of randomly walk edge and into the interior field. And about every 3 or 4 meters, you would stop and look down at a plant and look for beetles. When the plants are small, this is very easy. You can just see one plant, right? The beetles are most active in the morning. And as it gets later in the day, they're going to hide in the plastic. So you can look in the plastic hole if you're scouting in the afternoon. If you're scouting in the morning, you may want to sort of shake the plant or flip the leaves over to look on the underside for beetles. When the plants get larger and are vining together, then we use a 1 by 1 meter square as a representative plant, and that's what you look at looking for those beetles. And if you reduce your insecticide applications by just one, you cover the cost for a scout to go in your field and be monitoring and checking for that threshold. And so it's very feasible. Highly recommend scouting for cucumber beetles. Squash vine borer is sort of intermittent. We don't see it as often, but we do have a passive way of monitoring for this insect, and that is with pheromone traps. So the best trap to use is this Heliothids cone trap. You want to install it at the border of your field at the canopy height. And we have the opportunity to purchase a lure that smells like the female moths. And so you put that lure in the bottom of that trap, and male moths who are active and on the landscape and looking to mate with female moths will find that scent and follow it to the source, get caught under that triangle shaped trap, and then they try to fly up to get away. And so they get caught in this collection basket at the top. In theory, squash vine borers have 2 primary activity periods where they're out on the landscape and laying eggs. So if you can put this trap in your individual field, you can then detect the time at which your crop is vulnerable and the adults are on the landscape laying eggs. And then you can do more intensive scouting of the plants, or if this is a pest that you encounter often,
time your applications for when those reproductive adults are actually present on the landscape. And then there are several things you can do to help sustain beneficial insects. So this is talking about pollinators as well as some of those natural enemies. So consider companion plants, and that just means planting another crop alongside of your target crop. In most situations, we're talking about flowers because we want to provide floral resources. In larger scale systems, this can be implemented in insectary strips. So this idea of planting a strip intentionally either within your crop or around the border edge of your crop to provide more of sort of a refuge and a reservoir for those beneficial insects and pollinators to reside when maybe the resources that they need are not present in the cash crop that you're trying to protect. But when we say this, plant flowers, it's important that you plant useful flowers. So native flowers, if you can. Perennial, obviously, it has less work once you get them established. A range of colors, shapes, and flowering times is the most important because the idea is that you want to be able to sustain both natural enemy populations and pollinator populations beyond the crucial either flowering period of your cash crop or the crucial time of when pests are present on the landscape. And most of our natural enemies feed on floral resources when prey items are low. So having flowers early in the spring all the way through late in the fall provides a suitable habitat where they can be feeding and nesting and overwintering and providing them then a close habitat to be able to move into your cropping system when those resources become available. The most important thing is that you obviously need to put these in a place that are not going to be exposed to potential pesticide drift. So that's where I say establishing perennials around the borders of your fields and making sure that pesticides are not drifting over onto that habitat is really important. Otherwise, you're pulling in all your natural enemies, and then if it's in the middle of your field and they get sprayed when you're spraying for pests, you're also decimating those beneficial insects that you're trying to promote. And there are some resources. So this resource unfortunately comes from Oregon, but it's really valuable, I think. So it can help at least when you're making those decisions about what do I select to plant and when. So this study from the Garden Ecology Lab surveyed these different floral species across 3 years and documented the number of bee species that are visiting those flowers. So not every flower is created equal, right? Douglas aster had 74 species of bees visiting it, and that indicates that it's a very important resource for a wide community. Whereas lavender only had 8 species. We have similar guides for native plantings in the Midwest and Indiana in particular from Purdue. I'm not sure what Michigan has to offer, but I think if you seriously consider making this investment on your farming landscape, it's important to do your research and pick the floral resources that will grow well on your soil type and in your climate, but will also provide the most benefit that you're aiming for in terms of whether it's pollination or natural enemies. When you do use pesticides, utilize them in a way that minimizes their negative impacts. So this can be done through product selection, making those threshold-based applications, or even altering the timing at which you're applying those products to minimize runoff or non-target effects in terms of exposure to some of those beneficial insects. So I always have to put a plug for the Midwest Veg Guide. This is the best place for you to start to really understand what your options are in your crop. So you can pick your crop, pick your pest, and also your control measure here, and it can give you a variety of options. This is just a table from a handout that I made that falls. But so when you're thinking about cucurbit, you want to put your plan in place, obviously, before the growing season, right? And so it's important, again, to recap what are the potential pests that I could be encountering. And this is just a table that I made. And I think it's important to think about the occurrence. Some of these that are common are going to be a priority when we're developing our pest management systems. Squash bugs, cucumber beetles, aphids. Some of the other ones that are rare, I think that's where you want to have a backup, a plan in place in case they appear, but maybe don't need to be spending all of your energy on. And then if you go to that veg guide, you can pull this information. So here I have just a table of some of the active ingredients from the insecticides that we have available that we can use on cucurbits. Important for resistance management is this IRAC code. and making sure that if you're going to make multiple applications, you're rotating between these codes. Especially important in our flowering crops is looking at this bee precaution. So this is what's available on your product label to help you determine if it is beneficial or if it's particularly harmful to bees or what we would consider a safer bee insecticide. And so the green, obviously, here are the best choices. The yellow is in between. Red is going to be the most damaging. And then I've created just on the table here in terms of what pests you can use for these products. In some cases, you can use one product to target multiple pests. In other cases, they're very pest specific. And I would argue that it's important to choose pest specific if it's available, because oftentimes that minimizes the impacts on those beneficial insects. So for instance, we have a variety of chemistries that are selective for piercing sucking insects in particular. So if aphids are a problem in your crop, using something like flonicoimid, which is very effective at managing aphids, and one application we have seen provide season-long protection, is a good investment. This has translaminar activity, so it moves through the plant tissues, but only gets those piercing sucking insects. It's not very effective at squash bugs, but another similar product that targets piercing sucking insects is sulfoxaflor. This is another one that is effective at squash bug management. And so it's going to minimize impacts on natural enemies and pollinators in the system. The other thing I would say is use the lowest rate when possible. Oftentimes that is sufficient to get your pests under control. But again, we have a variety of resources available to help you make these decisions. And if you haven't done so yet, now is the time to be looking at what your options are in anticipation of pests that you may have struggled with, and really looking at selective chemistries, minimizing the impact on beneficial insects. So the Midwest Veg Production Guide, that database I showed you, you can access it online or you can get a paper copy. We also have out of Purdue a high tunnel cucumber production guide. So that is tailored specifically for cucumber production in high tunnel systems. And last but not least, the Plant and Pest Diagnostic Lab to really get a better understanding of pathogens on the ecosystems in cucurbit production. It's really important to be submitting samples. There's not only insect transmitted pathogens, but there are also seed-borne pathogens that we've been discovering as we continue to look deeper at what is causing some of the symptoms we have in our cucurbit crops. So with that, I will take any lingering questions at the end.